question for the administration. How much is the construction on phase 2? What is the total construction cost of phase 2, which is the retail and parking? Amount, dollar amount. Ma'am, please have a seat.
Just have 30 seconds.
Ma'am, please
I
have a
would like
seat.
to clarify something.
Please have a
All
seat.
the residents of the Venetian Causeway pay their taxes to the city of Miami. I wanted that to be clarified. Our address says Miami Beach, but we're residents of the city of Miami.
Ma'am, you did speak. Now you're out of order. She spoke. Now she's out of order. It's just the way things, I mean, I don't come to your house and tell you how to serve dinner. I know, but I'm telling you that this is the rules that we're trying to operate within the rules. I don't want to go back and forth with you. Ma'am, you're out of order. You can't speak as long as you want. It's not how. Ma'am, you're out of order. You know, when people are out of order, sometimes people get removed from the chambers. I haven't had to do that. We've had, because they're not special interests. They have a contract with the city. Ma'am, did you get a chance to speak? I allowed you to speak after the time ended. She spoke before the time ended. Mr. Chairman, according to our documents, phase 2 is $31.2 million. $31.2 million. Correct. Do you have a closed financing agreement in the amount of 38.2? 31.2. 31.2. Have you seen a closed financing agreement in the amount of $31.2 million?
Commissioner, when you say closed, you mean?
I mean closed. I mean there's a very specific industry term when a financing
that's what I wanted to
is closed. I mean it's funded by the bank. It's declared closed by the lending institution.
Thank you.
There's lending documents. And there's a variety of things. Money has changed hands.
Thank you.
We do not have yet a closed loan. That has to do with the self-financing, I believe, but they can talk about that.
Mr. Chairman, as part of the conditions precedent that we submitted to the city before entering into the ground lease, there's an affidavit from Mr. Bayraktar, which is part of your public record, that states that he will self-finance that portion of the project.
Okay. So let's go to the agreement to enter, which is the condition precedent that, I don't know, you may or may not be talking about. So when you look at 6.1.2 of the agreement to enter, for the ones that are tracking it, it says here, closing of construction loan, semicolon, other period, underlined. For each major project component, Flagstone shall have closed its initial construction loan with an approved initial construction lender as defined in the ground lease, which financing thereunder, together with the amount of an initial equity requirement or more as Flagstone may determine to invest into the same applicable to the relevant major project components, shall be sufficient to complete the development and construction, either all at once or on a component-by-component basis, at Flagstone's option of the applicable major project component of the projects, and to fund any shortfalls in operation that may exist prior to project stabilization for such major project component. So, according to the agreement to enter, pay-as-you-go is not an option. You have to provide, I just read from one of the conditions precedent. Now, what I find a little interesting is then you go to the ground lease itself, which you would think would track the same language as the language in the agreement to enter, but it doesn't. It's different. And it's a little interesting because it says in section 13.3 of the ground lease, funding of project. To the best of lessee's knowledge, little I, lessee has access to sufficient funds to satisfy the initial equity requirement as defined in section 6.1 and then little I2, as of the possession date, lessee will have closed upon an approved construction loan regarding one or more major project components. I found that interesting because that language is different than the language in the agreement to enter. Now it says you don't need to provide financing for the actual component part. You can get by having financing on only one of the component parts, which of course today somebody handed me for the first time in all this discussion a first leasehold mortgage and assignments of rent and an approved lending instrument in the amount of $22,668,000 for the first component, which is the marina, which was, I think, done as pay-as-you-go, and then it was there was some money borrowed against it. First of all, I think the problem with that is that it evidences a extremely different scenario than what is contemplated under the agreement to enter. And so that's why I thought it was important when you mentioned that particular clause, which I believe is section 38.3, which says, this amended and restated ground lease shall supersede and control any and all prior agreements and negotiations between the party, whether oral or in writing, except for the agreement to enter. So I would argue that the agreement to enter, for purposes of this clause that conflicts with the lease, which, by the way, I don't know why that conflict exists, unless you're trying to find a way to get around the fact in a lease that there is a very specific requirement that for you to enter into the lease, you have to have financing that's closed prior to the lease commencement date. I don't know how you explain that the lease is different from the agreement to enter.
So you're saying if they're in conflict, the agreement to enter would prevail?
Correct. And I would further say that I don't even know why there is a conflict. There shouldn't be a conflict, because it's very, very simple and very, very logical. And I even found it strange because I had to reread it over and over again.
And also tell me, why do you think that the agreement to enter will prevail rather than the subsequent?
Because it says it in section 38.3 of the lease.
The agreement to...
Right, it says here, this amended and restated ground lease shall supersede and control over any and all prior agreements and negotiations between the parties, whether oral or in writing, except for the agreement to enter. So to me, it seems like the city was trying to bypass something that was in a requirement, a condition precedent of the agreement to enter. I don't know why they were trying to bypass it. That's what it seems like, because if the agreement to enter says very clearly there's 3 component parts, and it makes sense. For each component part, you have to demonstrate prior to getting a lease that you can actually construct that component part. And the way to do it is by presenting a loan, a closed loan, which is important because pay-as-you-go is a nice concept, but you can always stop paying. Whereas when you have a bank, whoever that bank may be, that comes in and closes a loan and says, hey, we have the money to do $32 million worth of construction, that bank has put themselves on the hook. And therefore the city has an assurance, and its residents have an assurance that that is actually going to be completed. We're not just saying, hey, we're gonna pay as you go, we're gonna allow for pay as you go, et cetera, which, by the way, is not contemplated in any of these agreements. So that's a huge concern for me. And I think to me we've had a lot of stuff on the record about whether or not they commenced construction. You know, Commissioner put something, Mr. Dubbins put something, Mr. Fine put something, Mr. May put something, and I'm gonna leave that record intact as is. But I have a big issue with this clause and the way that it was incorporated into the lease, which is different from the way it was set forth in a very logical manner in the agreement to enter. And I still think by the way, I would have just said this is unbelievable to me, which it is kind of. But the fact that there is a provision, which makes a lot of sense, that the agreement to enter, because it's the master agreement, it's what we voted on, supersedes the lease, which we do not vote on, and is negotiated by the city manager without our knowledge and approval. It actually makes a lot of sense that the agreement to enter, in terms of a conflict with governing, it makes a lot of sense that you cannot make it easier than what the agreement to enter has specified for purposes of demonstrating that you can do one of the component parts.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
with regard, I think this situation comes up often in terms of contract review and judges and juries trying to figure out what contracts mean. And very often is the case where a contract that's written in 2010 is superseded by another contract that is written in 2016. So if there is a provision, for instance, the default provision that Mr. Dubbin was talking about, that says in the original agreement says you can't cure a default, but the 2016 agreement between the parties says you can. Of course, the later agreement. Of course, the later agreement takes control. And the idea, if you read the whole contract, you look at 6.1 of, and this is going back to the 6.1 of the agreement to agree.
Right.
That lays out the whole idea. Basically, is we're going to do this in phases, and as the developer meets all the conditions precedent for the earlier to get that ground lease, okay, you've shown you can do something. Okay, you built a marina on time and in less time than you were supposed to. Okay, they then negotiate the ground lease. The ground lease provides different terms than the agreement. And of course, the later agreement is what binds you. And with all due respect, the commission may not like it. The commission, my guess is the commission was not kept out of the process, and I can't answer that. But the agreement says for any, and this is 6.1, for any major project component for which the conditions precedent have been satisfied, in order to enter into one or more ground leases, then the provision of this amendment shall terminate, except for those expressly surviving, and the applicable ground lease shall control. So if you have a difference in the language from one to the other, of course the later agreement controls.
Mr. Chair, I think you're wrong on that, Mr. Fine, and I'll tell you why I think you're wrong on that. In 2010, we voted on the agreement to enter. So it would make sense that if there were a conflict between a document that we voted on as a commission, as a body, and some subsequently negotiated document, that the will of the commission would want to prevail, would want to be the governing sort of mode of negotiations for precisely reasons like this. Otherwise, you would allow the manager to potentially negotiate more favorable terms subsequent to the vote. And I don't think that was the intent of this commission. I think the intent of this commission at the time was, and essentially did give Flagstone a second opportunity to do this project under a different construct, which was a phasing construct. But I don't think their intent was to give unfettered discretion to the manager so that they could...
Well, I'm going to let Mr. May comment, but I would
Just
begin by saying...
a quick comment, if I may, sir. My staff is telling me that in the 2010, when the commission voted, it actually included a copy of the master agreement that would be later...
Sure, but it wasn't entered into until this year, correct?
No, the agreement wasn't entered into
last year, I'm sorry.
That agreement wasn't entered into last year, but it was a copy of the record back when it was originally up.
That even strengthens my argument, because I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why it strengthens my argument. Because in the two documents, you have a clear provision in the agreement to enter, in the ground lease, that says that as between the agreement to enter and the ground lease, the agreement to enter controls. And I suspect that the reason why it was done was so that later on, if a lease was subsequently negotiated, which it was, and I haven't compared the current lease to the lease that we voted on, that provision may be the same, it may be different, I have no idea. It may be the same, it may be different, I don't know. But I suspect that the reason why was because they didn't want the subsequent manager to deviate from the phasing requirement and the financing that is required of each phasing component as evidenced in the master agreement.
Well, with all due respect, Commissioner, I think Mr. May will tell you that some of the suppositions you're making are untrue, but putting those aside, if the Commission felt like the financing wasn't in place properly and allowed all this to go on over since September of 2000, 16, just using that date, okay? Not a word about financing until 15 seconds ago, 15 minutes ago, whenever you started, okay? You can't.
When is the statute of limitation for filing suit?
People who are in contract with others
Right.
can't lead someone down the road and saying, hey, you're all right, you're all right, you're all right, and then have a new group of people come in and say, hey, what about this?
Well, I'll tell you this,
Okay.
to one of the questions.
And then to get to the result that my friend Sam suggests, that you should just throw them out. I mean, that's nonsense.
That's neither here nor there. For me, I can tell you first of all that I was not approached prior to the execution of the ground lease with any sort of discussion. Certainly had someone approached me from the administration and said, hey, we're going to execute this ground lease and we're going to put a provision in here which says that we can count a lending document or a lending instrument from a prior phase as compliance for a lending instrument for the next phase, I would have said absolutely not, under no circumstances.
I don't think that's what I said.
No, I'm not saying that you said that. I'm telling you that you said that you presumed that the administration had met with us prior to entering into the lease, and I'm saying that they did not. And had they met
I
with,
think he just said that the ground lease was attached to the agreement to enter into a ground lease, and that it's the same as it is now.
a proposed ground lease was
It's the
submitted.
same as it is now.
I understand, but for provisions that are in conflict, the conflict is governed by the agreement to enter, not by the proposed lease.
Can you recognize?
Yeah.
Daniel Rotenberg, Department of Real Estate and Asset Management. You mentioned before the loan. I have two personal statements, affidavits in front of me, one of which I think I need to read to you. 4.4 of this says there's no construction loan for the development and construction of the retail/parking component of the project, which is subject to the ATD, the parking, the retail component. 4.5 then says FIG, which is the entity here, and its affiliates are funding the full and complete development and construction of the retail parking component. That's more powerful than a bank loan. This is their
It's
guarantee
more
to
powerful
pay.
than a bank loan? An
This is
affidavit?
their-
So if I gave you an affidavit right now that said that I could fund a $32 million phase 2 from a project, that would be more powerful than a
If it's
bank loan.
signed and notarized,
It's as good as
it's
an
a
IOU,
personal
right?
guarantee.
Like the
A
movie.
bank loan doesn't have a personal guarantee. This is.
It's as good as an IOU. Right.
Mr. Suarez, one point for the record is,
Sure.
I think in all fairness, it's not as if the administration accepted the idea that Flagstone was going to self-fund the retail parking component without context.
Okay.
They did it because they understood that Flagstone actually funded the marina component out of their pocket to the tune of over $50 million, right? Significant amount of mitigation and dredging, far over budget than we expected. So I just want to put that on the record. It's not as if Mr. Bayraktar has not demonstrated very clearly that he has an ability to self-fund portions of the project. And he put on the record two affidavits. Okay, one stating that the equity has overall in the project since 2001 is $92 million. That's number one. And number two, that he would in fact self-finance the parking retail component. That after having actually performed under the marina component and having it built.
Mr. Chair.
So I just wanted to put that on the record.
Got it,
That's all.
Mr. Chair. Thank you. Let me address sort of that issue. I don't think an affidavit, with all due respect, is sufficient. If you look at 12.1.2 of the agreement, where it says financial resources and evaluation of the project, it says, at such time as Flagstone enters into the related ground leases for each of the applicable major projects, Flagstone shall represent and warrant to the city, to the best of Flagstone's knowledge, number one, A, or little I, Flagstone has access to sufficient funds to satisfy the initial equity requirement regarding such major project component. Little I2, as of the lease delivery date, Flagstone shall have closed upon an initial construction loan for the applicable major project component or components, and the total of such sums will be sufficient to carry out the development and construction of the applicable major project components and to operate the applicable major project components. I think the reason why that's in here is, again, because you want to get a bank on the hook. Once you have a bank that has loaned the money, that bank has to be committed to the project. With let's say, for example, that they had not just presented an affidavit, but let's say that they had attached to that affidavit a bank account that had $35 million in it, enough to pay as you go, right? There's nothing that says that tomorrow they can't withdraw that money from the bank account.
Not an escrow.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that says that they can't take that money and put it somewhere else. Or if they fall on hard times or something else happens, they can use that money to fund some other project that they find has a higher rate of return. The reason why this language is in there is to require that a bank participate in this phase so that the people know that the project is going to get built. And that was not done. By the way, it says here, Flagstone shall provide to the city at least 30 days in advance of the proposed lease delivery date for each major project component such pro forma, budget, financial, and other commercially reasonable written information necessary for the city's review to determine the pro rata amount of the initial equity requirement for that major project component and to determine that such initial equity requirement has in fact been met for the particular major project component. I don't think that is just an affidavit. With all due respect.
Mr. Chairman, as a follow-up to my colleague.
Can I just one last thing? In the meantime, they failed to pay their taxes to the city. So in addition to all which they cured,
I have to just stop
which they
That's so
cured,
ridiculous.
they failed to pay their taxes to the city, which they cured. Okay, but you know, you're asking us to take on the one hand on faith that they have the money to do this. We haven't seen it. We don't know what account it's in. We don't know if it's really in an account. We don't know if it's in an account that they can move the money from. The documents require financing for each project component. And in the midst of all that, they default on their taxes, which they cured.
They did not default on their taxes.
They didn't pay their taxes.
No, they paid their taxes in 2016.
They paid their taxes late.
Hold on. Exactly the same time they paid them in 2000 last year.
Okay, they paid them late both
They
years.
may have around May 20th of each year is when they paid their taxes.
But they paid them late both years.
Yeah, but they're not in default.
Okay,
There's
so
no
they paid
lien
them
on the
late.
property. There's no notice. Nobody's at jeopardy here.
If
They
paid
got a
them,
notice and they paid the taxes. $800,000. They short the check. And now you're telling me they don't have the money? I don't know.
why were they late?
I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Royal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think my colleague is making a very compelling argument that besides the permitting, there is actually yet another issue with Flagstone that most would think will find them in default. I've been patiently here listening to all sides, and I want to address some of the issues that were mentioned. And I have to admit, and I have to say it, you know, many times elected officials talk about vision. Vision for the future. And vision could be looked at in many different aspects. One is, back in 2010, before we had additional hurdles that we may have to cross, is seeing a vision that this is not a good deal for the city of Miami. A vision that if we continue, it's going to be more agony. And to be honest with you, simply put, like I said, it's not a good deal for the city of Miami. A vision of seeing 15 years of curing. In other words, deadlines being missed and curing, taxes not being paid and curing, and continuously curing and curing and curing. As a matter of fact, back in 2010, I asked the city attorney, what was the definition of stringing us along? Honestly, I think we've seen it. It took 6 years, but we've seen it. This is what's stringing us along, and us being the city. You know, I appreciate everyone that came forward and spoke. I appreciate the marine industry coming forward. and saying how canceling this contract or defaulting Flagstone and trying to obtain the land back would impact the marine industry. That anything that would slow down the purpose will be viewed as hurting the marine industry. I respectfully ask, where has the marine industry been for the last 15 years when it has been slowed down? When what has been promised to the voters and to the residents hasn't been met? What has been promised to the marine industry hasn't been met. I wish they would have come here in 2010 and really, stuck up and put their voices on the record. However, I still appreciate that they came forward. Mr. Fine came and mentioned very compelling argument with regards to the continuance of a agreement, of a contract, even beyond the life of certain elected officials. So in other words, if my predecessors enter into agreement, just because new commissioners come in, shouldn't just be able to break the contract. He has a strong point there. However, he has a strong point until one of the parties is found in default. And if one of the parties is found in default, then everything changes. So it's not necessarily that we didn't like what our predecessors did, and therefore we're going to stop paying and we're going to break the contract. No. Our predecessors came into an agreement, and if one of the parties did not honor that agreement and they're found in default, then yes, the new commissioner can step up and do the right thing. Mr. May made some powerful arguments with regards to our professional staff. Let me be clear. I'm the first one that will tell you we have very, very good staff. We have very good employees that put in a lot of hours and that work very hard. At the same time, we have some of our professional staff that not necessarily work to the point that I just mentioned. For instance, our professional staff entered into some type of agreement with a developer that we were going to have a fire station built within that development at no cost to the city. Except they forgot to put it in writing. And everybody was under the impression that the city of Miami was going to obtain a fire station in a very needed area, an area that is really growing within Brickell, the West Brickell area. And unfortunately, our professional staff did not put that in writing. And it took us a very long time to be able to get that developer to do the right thing and put it in writing. So, although I do believe we have very good staff, let's be clear. There's been a lot of errors committed. As many of you know already, I'm a native Miamian. And from a very young age, I remember going to Watson Island and seeing the fishermen there selling their fish. We kicked those people out. We kicked them out. And for what? To wait. To wait. We have a history. How do you kick those people out in good faith? Not allow our residents to use that land? And more importantly, move forward with arguments that Flagstone is in good standings. Maybe we should even give them a commendation from what I've heard. About the amount being paid, I think it was $6.3 million. $6.3 million in 15 years. You don't have to be a CPA like myself or a finance wizard to know $6.3 million in 15 years. You know what? You should have put that on the ballot 15 years ago and told our residents that in 15 years you were going to get $6.3 million instead of what you put that you said we were going to be receiving. The city was going to be receiving $2 million per year. In all fairness, in these days' value, that's still a ripoff. But you know what? At least when you mention with regards to the voters, you should have put in the ballot language. We're not going to build it for the next 15 years, and within those 15 years, we're going to pay the city $6.3 million, and you should be happy. Again, it doesn't take a CPA or a finance whiz to really know that. It's outrageous. You know, I'm talking about the ballot language. I put an item in the ballot language back in 2015. And most people knew it was just because of Flagstone. Because just because you get approval 12 years before, 15 years before, 10 years before, doesn't mean that that approval lasts for an eternity. And that referendum passed by more than 10 points over what the original ballot language in 2001 passed. So the voters agreed that you have X amount of time to do what you're going to build. If not, you need to go back to the voters. Because we really don't know right now if the voters' minds have changed, as they have many times. What if now we don't need that type of development in the city of Miami? What about now we should do a traffic study or have a traffic study? We should consider that. I mean, in all fairness, you know, Miami Beach, although I get it, maybe some of the people that were here do not live in the city of Miami, they live in Miami Beach, but you know what? They're our neighbors. And we should have good relationships with our neighbors. So we haven't had that opportunity to go back to the voters and see if maybe there's something else that we should obtain. You know, maybe a park, as opposed to what is there in the plans. Not to mention, back in 2001, I don't think, talking about vision, there was that vision about a walkway or a bay walk. You know? Maybe that should be in the language. I haven't confirmed this, but it's my understanding that right now, even city residents still don't have access to the property. So if you want to go there, look at the scenery, look at the skyline, take pictures. You're not allowed. How could that be? You know, I tell you, I mean, Mr. May does a very good job. He really does. I mean, when he comes here and he sells it the way he does. But the bottom line is, it's been 15 years later, it hasn't been built, the city's been ripped off financially, and not even just financially. Where have our residents had the opportunity to enjoy that piece of land, one of the most valuable pieces of land in our city of Miami? So to say that we should issue a resolution that Flagstone's in good standing 15 years after the fact, I mean, listen, it's incredible how that could happen. I feel very strong that today we could right a wrong that's been happening for many, many years, and go back to our residents to see exactly what they will want.
Sure.